Because there is a famous Irish literary hotel and kind of festival.
That's in Listowel. Yeah, there's a ferry that goes from Killimer to Tarbert in County Kerry, and then you can, it saves you going through Limerick, which even people in Limerick would rather not go through Limerick sometimes. Yeah, Listowel is a very famous little village. It has a castle. It's the home of a writer called John B. Keane, who died a couple of years ago, who was one of those great chroniclers of Irish life, I think, of Irish village and town life. He wrote The Field,
right.
Which was a play first and then a movie with Richard Harris, and was based on a real incident. The Field was based on the killing of a man over a patch of land, and a tiny patch of land, and it was about that kind of passion Irish people have for land, because we didn't own it for so long. And I think that's why every Irish person seems to want a garden. You know, we couldn't live in apartments. We still struggle with that. We like having a patch of land. And Keane wrote about that, and then basically founded a literary festival in Listowel. And it's a wonderful, wonderful festival. It's really great. It's mainly supported by locals, so you're talking to local people, and it's their festival. And you know, the bars stay open until all hours. There's a little village up from it called Ballylongford, which is where my mother is from. And they have a poet called Brendan Connolly, who was a professor of English in Trinity College, recently retired. And there's a smaller festival there, which I've done occasionally because it's my mum's village, and they ask. And the last time I was there, the natives are very irate, because at 4 o'clock in the morning, the guards came from Listowel to point out that they actually should have closed the pubs 4 hours before. And there was outrage. How dare they come on our weekend and tell us that we can't drink 4 hours after closing time on the streets of our own village? It's a dictatorship. They were up in arms, and I thought, this is what I like about this country, you know. They more or less hunted them out of the village. They told the guards, don't be messing with us here now tonight. We're having a good time. Go off and bother somebody else up the road, you know. Nobody driving here. Everybody's having a good time, and we'll all walk home.
Well, we can all walk home, obviously. So one of the things that I was so impressed about was that there were so many august literary personages plastered all over the walls in the hotel in Listowel. And I said to Rob, I don't know how small this festival is, but we're talking, you know, world-famous authors here, great prize
a lot of people,
winners,
given that we share crime in common. Lawrence Block is somebody who's gone there for very, very many years. And I got an email from Stephen White, who had created the...
Lovely man from
Yeah,
Denver.
very lovely. And it turns out that we're distantly related through my mother, because his family had come from Ballylongford as well, and I was trying to convince him to come to Listowel. Somebody must come to Listowel. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a great festival. They once accidentally gave me the honeymoon suite at the Listowel Arms Hotel.
That's beautiful.
For 2 nights.
Does it look out on the river?
It looks out on the river, and it has seated windows. They gave it to me because I locked my key in my room, and I went down to complain at 4 in the morning, a bit tipsy. And the little old man behind the door said, well, I can't get to the keys of the rooms because people are in them. And I went, well, I know that. I'm in one of them, but I want my key. And he goes, well, we don't have a spare key for that. Because once somebody's in the room, that's their room, and I can't be handing out keys to strangers. And I went, but I'm not a stranger. It's my room. I don't want to sleep in the bar. So he rummaged in the drawer for empty rooms and gave me a key and said, off you go and sleep there. And I think it took them 2 nights to figure out that I was actually sleeping in the honeymoon suite, which was just beautiful. I was entertaining people.
I think that's fabulous. But one of the reasons that I wanted to do this whole Irish thing is that so far in my experience, you've only got the one book about Ireland, and the rest of them are largely set here in America. And my favorite of all your books, and I'm a big fan of all your books, is this lovely book here called The Book of Lost Things. And that's a book where you really want to talk about storytelling and Celtic legend and...
Well, I want to talk about fairy tales, not so much Celtic legend, but certainly fairy tales and folk tales. I've always been interested in them, and I wanted to write about my childhood, and that transition from childhood into adulthood. And the peculiar thing about fairy tales and folk tales is that we tend to tell them to very young children, and we tend to sanitize them because they seem quite violent. They're actually not really meant for very young children. They were about that transition from childhood into adulthood. That's what Red Riding Hood is about, that transition from being a girl into a woman. Hansel and Gretel is about that, the idea that at some point your parents aren't going to be there to look after you, and you're going to have to find your way in the world. And I think what I particularly liked about them was that they were not moral stories. Fairy tales are not morality tales.
Right.
Fairy tales don't tell you the good way to live life. They tell you to be clever. And if it means putting one over on somebody, then that's okay, as long as you come out on top. They're quite ruthless in their way. And I wanted to write about my own childhood. As a child who loved books and reading, and who lost himself in books and reading, and used books as a way of interpreting the world, which I think those of us who who really love reading do that, even though we may not do it consciously, but books become a kind of prism through which we refract our experiences. And I wanted to try and explain that to the reader, that importance of books. I think we've all had that experience occasionally of opening a book and reading something in it and thinking, my God, I felt that, or I've been through that. And it's a marvelous moment of empathy between two people who may never meet. It's that moment when the author kind of reaches out from the book and touches your hand. And you could be divided by centuries, the author could be long dead, but if you've been through something difficult, or if you've been through grief or loss, there's that sense that you're not alone in the world, and that other people have gone through it, and if this person was sitting opposite you, he would go or she would go, I actually understand. I do understand what you're going through. And it's a marvelous moment for readers. The other thing is that I get really annoyed with people who say they don't read fiction. You know, there's people who go, I don't read fiction, I read history. Why would I read something that's made up? And I always want to kind of hang a couple of them outside libraries as examples. When I go through town, like, I have a posse of people. Because it's an amazingly narrow-minded thing to say, that idea that fiction, that human experience, individual human experience, has nothing to say to us. That we're all so completely different that somebody in France who was writing 200 years ago, or somebody in Scottsdale writing now, could have nothing in common with me on the other side of the world. And I also think it's a very selfish attitude. I think readers of fiction are very unselfish people. My father used to think that, I think that reading was a selfish pursuit, that he would say, why don't you go out and see people? Go out on the streets and, you know, get a bit of air.
Okay, but he's confusing the fact that it's a solitary or solipsist
absolutely,
activity with
absolutely,
selfish.
Absolutely, he did. And I don't think, he wasn't a big reader, certainly not a big reader of fiction. But I think reading a work of fiction and enjoying it and immersing yourself in it requires you to sacrifice a little bit of yourself, because you have to suspend your judgment a little bit, and you have to be willing to allow yourself to be lost in the book and to be lost in another person's perspective on the world. And books, particularly works of fiction, are the only form of art that allows us to do that.
That's true, but don't you think that in part we read fiction to get in touch with that universal? I mean, I do.
Absolutely, we do.
It's a talking point that truly disparate people can manage to achieve, because if they've each read the book, even though each person has in fact read a different book.
Yeah.
Because every book is interpreted
sure,
through the reader.
Every book is different in that way.
But nevertheless, there is at least thus some commonality that people can share.
I think that's absolutely true. But I think to get that out of it, you have to be willing to say, well, for this time, I'm prepared to immerse myself in another person's view of the world, and see whether I'm prepared to accept that. And I think that element of sacrifice is what gives us enjoyment in a book. That willingness not to stand outside it, but to allow ourselves to be drawn in by it. And I love that about fiction. And the Book of Lost Things is about that. It's about a boy literally losing himself in books.
And the Book of Lost Things, I mean, all of us had a childhood, whether it was horrible or whether it was blessed, it doesn't really make any difference. It's a universal experience.
Absolutely.
There's some things that fiction chronicles that not everyone has themselves experienced, and sometimes maybe we live vicariously in fiction. Lee Child and I had an interesting discussion last week when he was here about the quest novel. You know, how one reason, it's like almost the oldest literary form, probably along with a coming-of-age novel, like A Book of Lost Things, is that many of us feel powerless or whatever, and we all wish that there were somebody who could ride into town and clean up town and make it all right and ride out of town. And in fact, it's kind of a relief to see him go. You know, it's like,
well, I think
but
that's one of the reasons why the quest novel resonates with us. The other is that, on a much deeper level, we are all engaged in a quest of our own, that we are all looking for something, we are all in search of some form of meaning, of some form of redemption, we are all trying to make sense of it. And that's why I think the quest has been very elemental, because it actually doesn't matter whether you're looking for Excalibur, whether you're looking for the Holy Grail, whether you're looking for any of those things that tend to figure in the kind of mythical interpretations of it. All of us are on that kind of journey. And I think that's why quest fiction in particular resonates with us, because we have that sense of purpose.
Well, I don't disagree with that. The only thing is that many people feel that they didn't or can't achieve it. So it's handy.
Well, many people haven't quite figured out what it is they're trying to find.
Well,
and that's a different thing. Once you're going to figure that out, then you're on the right road. But I think we recognize in it something very elemental about human beings, that desire to pursue something, to look for something, whether it is ultimately even just happiness or contentment. That in itself is a quest in life.